Objections list from City Attorney Zach Klein's office. I'm Councilmember Emmanuel Remy, Chair of the Public Safety Committee, and I welcome everyone that may be tuning in, and certainly want to remind everybody that this hearing is currently live on YouTube and Facebook, but it's also live and being recorded for rebroadcast on CTV, Columbus's Government Television Channel 3. The rebroadcast schedule is available at www.columbus.gov. So, each year, Columbus is required to submit any objections to the renewal of liquor permits within the city by December 31st. Throughout the calendar year, the City Attorney's Office works with community leaders, Columbus Police, Fire, Health, Building and Code Enforcement, as well as various state entities, including the Ohio Investigative Unit, to identify and investigate liquor permitted locations that have violations of state and city code and chronic criminal activity, including violent crime, overdoses, and liquor violations. Proposed objections are then presented to council, and if approved via resolution, are sent to the Ohio Division of Liquor Control. The objection does not result in any immediate change to business operations. The City Attorney's Office is committed to working with these businesses to enact appropriate security and safety improvements for their establishments and the surrounding neighborhood. Today, we will hear a presentation from Assistant City Attorney Sarah Pomeroy over the 9 liquor objections on this year's list. This is Council's second time reviewing the City Attorney's annual liquor objections in a separate public hearing from our regular Monday council meetings, in the hope to give more time for presentation and discussion ahead of any vote. Without further ado, I will turn the floor over to Assistant City Attorney Sarah Pomeroy for the presentation. I also see Detective Gant here as well. Thank you both for joining us. Sarah, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Chair Remy. Again, my name is Sarah Pomeroy. I am part of the unit of the City Attorney's Office that's called the Zone Initiative. And we were constituted basically to enhance communication between city code enforcement, various other city departments, the community, to focus on uplifting neighborhoods, especially focused on properties within neighborhoods, some of which include liquor establishments. There are 6 zone attorneys. We're each assigned to an area, but a handful of us, including myself, have citywide responsibilities. That's why I'm here today. I handle the city's liquor permit issues. So I'm just going to do a brief overview of the process that got us to this point, and then I'll go into the 9 locations. Certainly, I'm willing to take any questions at any point. There are 8 major steps to the permit objection process. First, we spend most of the year on the first 3, identifying establishments. Identification can come in through community complaints, through incidents that may happen at a location, through inspections that happen from the various city departments and state departments. We then spend the year investigating locations, evaluating ones that might be appropriate for objections, some that might be appropriate for nuisance abatement lawsuits. Either the evidence and the issues at play apply to both. And then we're here today for my office to then present recommendations to council. If council were to choose to put forward any sort of recommendation on these 9 places of an objection, that would go to the Division of Liquor Control, which then would set a hearing sometime in 2024, basically to assess whether or not that permit objection should go through. There's various appellate decisions that can happen after those hearings, but I would say the next bulk of time we spend most of our time is after an objection is actually working with the individual businesses, such that I would say the vast majority of the objections that have been lodged since our office has started doing this process this way, many come to some sort of resolution that results in either the business continuing to operate with certain security parameters, maintenance requirements, things like that, or that ownership either transfers or businesses end up voluntarily deciding to do something else with that permit. So as been previously mentioned, a lot of our work throughout the year is in partnership with Columbus Police, the Ohio Investigative Unit, Columbus Fire Department, Columbus Public Health, Code Enforcement. We involve area commissions and civic associations, block watches, other community members. They're often the first to identify that a location has had some sort of issue, or you have an incident, a major incident that happens. Largely what drives us in the liquor objection world and frankly the nuisance abatement world are liquor violations. drug activity, violent crime, especially focusing also on overdoses. Some locations also will have prostitution and solicitation issues. Those are sort of the bigger items that we would look for, but part of what we're investigating and identifying throughout the year are locations that might have health problems, violations of code enforcement, of building, of other issues that still contribute to whether or not it's a good operation of a liquor permitted establishment. Part of our process throughout the year also includes significant owner outreach. It's part of our normal course that if an incident, a violent crime, for example, a shooting, were to happen at a location, Detective Gant, actually here from the PACT unit, would send a warning letter to that location saying, hey, this incident happened, you might be up for either a nuisance abatement case or a liquor objection. Here's our contact information, please reach out to us, we would love to sit down. And then what ends up happening, I think maybe a third to a half of the time, is that we end up meeting with an establishment, coming up with a safety plan, and starting to implement, whether it's camera improvements, lighting improvements, additional security staffing throughout the year. So I think that notification is certainly the first step in trying to avoid ever having to get to this place. Some of the additional outreach items I think we've had this year is we've filed probably at least a dozen cases that are nuisance abatement related that I think have already either been resolved or close to being resolved, such that there's not more objections before council this year. We've had a couple real property owners just decide to evict their tenant, because what happens is we'll send a warning letter to the real property owner or to the business owner. Some businesses have transferred ownership and we end up working with the new owners. Some businesses implement the security recommendations and we see that calls for service and violent crime and overdoses drop. And some have resulted in lawsuits, but then we still are able to resolve the case and the location through the lawsuit. One additional thing that we really picked up this year, and you'll see that reflected in at least one of our objections tonight, is we have stepped up our work with after-hours clubs. So that is locations that may be operating to sell alcohol past the time permitted with their permit. And that's resulted in a number of lawsuits and at least one contributing factor for one of our places tonight. Certainly that's always a concern. The permits have a specific cutoff. If folks are operating afterwards, it tends to lead to other incidents, sometimes violent. So absent that nuisance abatement process and absent this process throughout the year, we might have dozens more that could be, eligible for objections. We really do try throughout the year to focus on what are the worst of the worst, and then also what are locations that, just based on the timing, because we have to do things by the end of December per the state, just need to be acted on now. As council member mentioned, that certainly doesn't stop sort of how we work with it, businesses. I think our process, I would argue we do it better than most in the state. As far as recommendations to council, that's why obviously we're here. If a recommendation for an objection is made and approved by city council, that does not stop the operation of the business. Establishments continue operating between that time period of the objection and any sort of hearing before the Division of Liquor Control. And honestly, conversations with permit holders have already started with a handful that are on the list this year. One of the things that we did do this year was last week, once we finalized the list, we did send out a letter notifying folks of today's hearing, as well as that the meeting for any votes would be next week. We already have one meeting set with one of our objected locations tomorrow, actually. So I think it's an example of sort of this being an iterative process, and really our goal is to try and find out what the best solution is for the business and then also for the neighborhood. And it often takes a little bit of everything, the business in implementing items and us working with them. Certainly, if there was a location that we felt should not be operating in the interim that needed to be closed now, those are ones that would have already either been filed as a nuisance abatement lawsuit, and including there's one that we'll have tonight that's already in the middle of a lawsuit and is closed. And so we have multiple options, depending on the urgency of what's happening. Certainly, we feel that all 9 presented today are urgent in terms of a need for a solution, but we have ways to moderate what is needed to be closed now versus needs to have a discussion versus needs to be under some sort of an agreement. Before I get into the last couple places, I'll just generally describe what our outcomes are. So if an objection gets put forward, there's a few ways it can end. So the objection could be sustained by the division. meaning we put forward enough evidence, there will be a separate hearing for any objection that is set by the Division of Liquor Control, and they might agree that the evidence we've presented and the activity there merits the non-renewal of a permit. The objection could be overruled for the opposite reason. Sometimes, and this does happen, businesses will choose to forfeit their permit, put it into effectively what is called safekeeping with the division, meaning we don't have a plan for this yet, but maybe we will, and the division can hold it and they can't operate in that interim. And then finally, we often result is an agreement with the city and the permit holder, again, implementing all of those security items. Detective Gant spends a lot of time throughout the year talking to businesses about ways they can continue to help increase safety at their locations. And I think more often than not, because our focus is on what can the establishment do to be a good neighbor, that's why we result in a lot of these different items that include those security requirements, operating procedures, training, things like that. And then one last comment I'll make before I jump in is adjacent to the annual renewal process, we often get a lot of questions about, well, if a new place pops up during the year, every week, City Council gets a list of all of the proposed liquor permit additions or transfers throughout the city, and my office doesn't just sit on those and wait till the end of the year. We actually every week are looking at what is the activity at every new permit requested location. Have there been community complaints? Does it meet the legal standard for a potential objection to a new location or a transfer? So at every sort of stage of the game, we are trying to engage both with the business and then also with our city partners and state partners about who is and who should be a good steward of a liquor permit. So just briefly, we have a quick slide just on the various types of permits. Gas stations and markets typically have the ones where you can only carry out and you can't consume on the premises. Bars are the opposite. So there's just various types of permits that are available for that. All right, I guess before I jump into the questions, jump into the specific places, council member, any questions on the general process?
Can we, I want to just highlight, because I know the process, we actually talk about these throughout the year. How do you talk about the communication? Like once you finally, because a lot of times some people don't respond, right?
Correct, yeah.
But you keep on it, and then eventually a dialogue opens up. Number of these came off before we issued the final because that dialogue had been continuing. Just talk a little bit more about that process and really, because the outcome is to have a small list.
Yeah.
That they work something out.
Absolutely, yes. So besides the initial letter that would go out after any sort of incident, we will also do group inspections at various places, which we try to include the locations that are potentials for liquor objections. So that will start a dialogue, and often you'll have places that will respond and work with Detective Gant to set up a meeting, usually with police, myself, and their management, sometimes their lawyers. So we talk about it that way. Unfortunately, it sometimes does take the objection to get everyone to the table. But that's why this process doesn't stop here, that the discussions don't stop here, is because we do have that time and have, I think the state also has trusted the city of Columbus to also not just automatically set things immediately. I think that they have seen how our process results in good outcomes for everybody. And so I would say a good third of my liquor work is literally just meeting with businesses, and we're open to certainly this list, but also any location, and that does result in sort of a whittling down to what ultimately needs an objection now, and again, not stopping the discussions, but what merits it now, and then we move on from that. Again, I think other processes might be, well, throw everything in and object to a bunch, but that doesn't necessarily result in the best of outcomes when we can try and head that off in the front end.
And then talk a little bit about, I'm sure you're going to cover this when we get into it, but there's a couple of, big chains on here. Are they more difficult to deal with? Does it take this to get their attention, or, like when we think of like a Speedway or a Sheetz, or I think is there a Pilot on there as well? Are those harder conversations to have than sometimes the mom and pop type establishment?
I wouldn't say that any one is harder than the other. It really comes down to whether or not we've already established a corporate contact. I think you'll you'll see that there are many chains. Everyone might see a certain chain and think, oh, that's all that business. Many of them are franchised, and so often those can be easier because you're just dealing with one point of contact at that one location. However, it's also very nice sometimes to be working with a corporate entity, because then they've got a point person for all the locations throughout the city. Speedway is a good example. We have a couple on tonight. We have built relationships with their council over the last year. So we've had some discussions, not specific enough to these places where we feel like they could come off, but those discussions are already teed up and ready to go because we've made the contacts for other corporate entities. Sheets, for example, that's on here, we've only just started a discussion with their corporate counsel. We didn't even have anybody identified prior to even just this past week or so. So, and Pilot is the same. We don't have someone identified just yet that would be at the higher level. So it just, everything is a little bit different, but we certainly approach every individual location with the same concerns, same questions. It's just a matter of how we get there ultimately.
And, we're going to take these up in a week or so. If you reach an agreement between then and now, or now and then, they will come off, right? We won't include them. Would that be accurate?
Yes. Yeah. So obviously, I think we're up on Monday. But if we were able to reach some sort of, certainly for us, it's always a written agreement, being able to put pen to paper about what the improvements might be, things absolutely could come off. What has happened in the past is that we've objected, and then there's some time between the objection in December and even the next available council meeting in January. And so I've had a few in the past years where we've worked over December, we have an agreement by January, and I'm before you all in early January to say, hey, we've got this one done and we're ready to just start to work with them. So that's also on the table too. All right. So we've got 9 this year. First, I'm going to start with Jack's Corner Pub. This one, I certainly no lack of, I think, coverage as far as the issues that happened here. This is a location that had a number of concerning gun incidents, highlighted, unfortunately, by a homicide in July, where a 23-year-old was shot multiple times after a fight at the bar. Issues had started back in 2022 here, and that actually leading to that homicide resulted in our office filing a nuisance abatement lawsuit in August, and the location has actually been closed since August. I've included on each of these slides the number of police reports. So you've got police reports where they actually go and they take, it's called a P1, an actual incident report, and then there's also calls for service, which are the actual police and fire 911 calls to a location. We certainly don't believe that just because there's no report that something didn't happen. Calls for service and police reports are both indicative of what is happening at a location. For Jack's Corner Pub specifically, this is one where we haven't gotten to the final resolution of this permit. So this is pretty frequent that we may have filed a lawsuit, we don't have the final signed, here's what's going to happen to this permit. From what I understand is that they're looking to sell that business, and so certainly, again, like that mid-year transfer process, we would have an opportunity to evaluate any new owner of Jack's Corner Pub or that permit, and if it were going to turn into something else. We are just at the point where we don't have that final resolution of the permit, and so therefore we, absent a resolution for it, we needed to present the objection. Next, we've got a location called Pack Lounge, which was opened, we're not 100% sure of the exact date, but sometime late last year to early this year. In August of this year, there was a homicide at the location. It is a very few number of runs, but we've had a number of community complaints about this location. It is in the Franklinton area. And we had some conversations with the real property owner. Letters went to real property owner, letters went to ownership. We had chats with who owned the real property, and they talked about it potentially being closed. But we are now seeing advertisements online for it being, operated potentially even after hours. This is an example of where sometimes you will have locations that have a permit, but then if they push the limits of that permit to having parties afterwards where there is alcohol sales or distribution, that is still a violation, regardless of whether or not you have a permit. So with this one, this is another one where we don't have sort of a final resolution, even though we've had conversations with the landlord there about not having that business continue. But, so again, we are seeking the objection for this one because of sort of the uncertainty there. All right, next we've got the Pilot Travel Center. This is on the west side at 3600 Interchange Road. I would, out of everything this year, this is our highest number of calls for service throughout the last 2 years. You can see 757 is probably the largest number I've ever had in terms of an objection. One of the frequent comments we get from business owners is, well, if I call the police, it's just going to count against me. And while we look at numbers as not just, numbers do not automatically make the objection. It is about what those calls are. But that doesn't mean that when you have such an excessive amount, and this really, I would say, is, given even in comparison to the other gas stations that are on the list here, that is a significant drain on police resources such that I think it begs the question that that location needs to bear some of the responsibility of managing the safety at that location. I do understand that they've had some security in the past. We've not, even though they have received a letter and have had an inspection, have not been able to sit down and have a comprehensive discussion with them. But as you can see, within those calls for service, we've had a number of concerning violent crime incidents, robbery, recovered firearms, assaults, but also a number of accidental overdoses, calls for solicitation, narcotics complaints. Those are truly the big items that concern us and I think are detrimental to the neighborhood. Next, we've got Ex-Gentlemen's Club, which has gone by different names over the years at the Sunderland Drive address. So this is an area of the Northland side of town where it is on a cul-de-sac that is pretty much smack dab within the middle of a neighborhood. I am the attorney assigned to the north side, and I actually started getting calls about this location, mainly for noise complaints, but also other just lots of activity back in 2021. It's not often that you have a location, any bar really, that sits within the middle of a neighborhood like this, but complaints started with noise, but there's been multiple calls for service to the location for gunplay, shots fired, people with firearms, other intoxicated individuals needing assistance. And then most recently, what I think pushed it over the limit for us this year was also that a person was recently found guilty of 2 counts of rape in August of this year, stemming from events that occurred at that location. So while you see a minimal number of police reports, I think what has happened there and been able to be documented by the police certainly is concerning. All right, our next few are a couple of those corporate entities that we were talking about. The first two are 2 different Sheetz addresses. So first we've got 3999 South Hamilton Road, which actually was the scene of a homicide in March of this year. The location hired special duty from police shortly thereafter, kept them for a few months, but there's not necessarily been any sort of permanent security plan implemented at the location. We sent the normal warning letters we normally do, got no response. Obviously, you can see in the runs that they tried, I think, having special duty to address those concerns, but overall, what you have in the reports and the runs, again, totaling over 200, are homicides, robberies, assaults, overdoses, stolen vehicles. I think frequently you'll see throughout all of the permit objections a lot of stolen vehicle issues, and I think that speaks to certainly a concern throughout the community, but also that there needs to be better monitoring of all of these locations if this is a place where people, A, can either feel free to steal a vehicle or drop off and leave a stolen vehicle. So Sheetz, which both this one and the next one, they are run corporately, and we do finally have a safety security personnel contact that just came out of the letters that were sent out last week. So we are hoping to start some good discussions with them and get to a good place with these 2 Sheetz locations. I believe Sheetz only came to the Columbus market just a few years ago, so it really is sort of a new market for everybody, both us in terms of knowing them and them in terms of knowing Columbus. I won't dwell too much on the second sheets. This is one where we've had a significantly higher number of runs that have happened there. The biggest violent crime incidences have been robberies, also a number of complaints about drug offenses and overdoses, OVIs, intoxicated individuals on the property and needing assistance, recovered stolen vehicles. But this would be one where having a corporate entity to work with is helpful because we can talk about both of these together and largely talk to the same security personnel that's worked in the past. This is also one I'll add that there's not been any special duty ever implemented here versus the Hamilton Road location. All right, our next two are a couple speedways. We have one on East Weber Road. Concerning police reports here include robbery, assaults, menacing, weapons offenses, and drug offenses. CPD and CFD have been dispatched pretty frequently, again, also over 200 times. Again, this is pretty similar to our last couple sheets locations. OIU with the state also cited the location for insanitary conditions in August of this year. And Speedway is one where we do already have corporate counsel contact and do have their security people. So this is one where we would feel pretty confident that we would be able to get to a resolution. And then our next one is South High Speedway. So this is, again, very similar. We have reports of a felony assault, robberies, drug offenses, motor vehicle theft, persons wanted for outstanding warrants. Calls for service include a shooting and a stabbing, unfortunately, persons with guns, multiple overdoses. And again, very high number of calls for service, but we would certainly treat this the same in terms of talking to the Speedway's corporate folks on a resolution there. And finally, we have Double D's Bar, which is at 1501 South High. This is while not a large number of actual police reports taken, of the 51 calls for service, a significant number have been either weapons related. There's been gun-related incidents and gunplay that resulted in a homicide also this September. And the good product of, again, one of our warning letters and stopping by that location is that we actually have a meeting set with the Double D folks tomorrow afternoon. So this is very much in the process of working with them. So far, they've been receptive about suggestions, just even from Detective Gant. So I think while it's on the table today because the incidents certainly concern us, this is, again, one that if we can come to some sort of resolution, we might be there, or this would be one that could be easily resolved over the course of the next month. So that's it for our 9. I'll leave it at that and just say I think that our process tries to take into account all of the neighborhood concerns, the concerns of all of the city partners and state partners, and also business owners, and trying to just get to what is the safest result for the neighborhood that keeps a business running if it's running the right way. And if folks are willing to work with us, we're willing to work with them.
When talk about the community involvement, did the zone attorneys hear it, from different communities? I mean, I know as a community leader, we would, of course, we got the hotel shut down, but then also would complain about things like the what was that one? I can't believe it's in the middle of Devonshire, and I forgot all about that place.
The M-Star? That hotel? Are you talking about that hotel?
No,
Yeah.
in this case, I was talking about the one on here, but
Yeah, the ex-gentleman's club,
yeah.
Absolutely. Yes, so as part of our zone attorney work, we're each assigned to an area of town, so each of us goes to each of those area commissions, block watches, community meetings, also police roll calls in those areas, and that's really where we often get sort of, hey, this is a place that I've been experiencing XYZ. Can you take a look? So yeah, it is certainly not just me. All of our zone attorneys, part of our process is if they hear of a place, they send it to Detective Gant and myself, and we start to look at it. Sometimes it's back and forth with patrol officers that have had experiences there. And often when we have a meeting with the location, it will be Detective Gant and myself, a patrol sergeant or officer who's dealt with the location, and then also the zone attorney to try and bridge that gap to locations. But yes, it is pretty frequent that the first onboarding of a location, if we're going to be looking at it, is from a community complaint or someone who's actually experiencing what's happening.
I mean, this is incredibly important work, obviously. Thinking about those hotels, I remember when we got the first 5 shut down up in Northland, that the year-over-year crime dropped within the vicinity 50%. And these types of establishments create people wandering in neighborhoods as well. I mean, and probably not doing, they're doing illicit things a lot of times, especially if they've been called so many times. So it's an important work for our residents to keep them safe. So
Yeah,
thank you
and
for that.
Thank you, yeah. And one thing we would add, I think, now we've ran some numbers, I don't have the exact figures in front of me, but across all the locations that we've either had a nuisance abatement lawsuit with or done one of these where we've gotten someone under an agreement and they've stayed under an agreement, we've seen at least a 40% drop in calls for service and criminal activity that's happened at locations that have been under these agreements. A lot of times it is just a matter of, I'd say 90% of the businesses want to do the right thing, and we just need to make sure we have that accountability, and that's why we like this process. There's very few where it is truly someone who is not trying. It is, what is the best sort of middle ground solution?
I mean, when you look at 757 calls, I mean, these are resources that take our officers away from, and our fire and everybody else, from doing the real work that needs to be done in our community. So, we are all for this, process because it makes such a difference. Detective Gant, would you like to just talk a little bit about what your role is and what you do as a team partner with the city attorney's office?
Thank you, sir. My role is I send out letters for places that are experiencing events, homicides, robberies, etc., high amounts of overdoses. I get complaints from patrol officers, community liaison officers, the city attorney's office. I conduct the NAG inspections with the group at these establishments, businesses, bars. I also make as much contact as many times as I can with owners, even their legal counsel, and set up meetings with Sarah and myself or any of the other zone attorneys to sit down and see if we can come up with ideas and solutions to these issues. I do a lot of security assessments for the markets and the bars, just recommendations for maybe how things can improve, whether it be hiring special duty or additional security that's licensed, ID scanners, more lights, more cameras, age limits on some of the bars, clothing limits, which they're entitled to do, just things like that.
Thank you. Is that the end of the presentation?
It is. Thank you so much.
Okay. Well, we did not receive any requests to speak today. We did receive one piece of written testimony, which we will forward on to my colleagues. But with that, I'd like to end this hearing by thanking our presenter, Assistant City Attorney Sarah Pomeroy, for your participation tonight and the great work that you do all throughout the year. Thank you to Detective Gant for being here as well. We expect to hear these liquor objections on Monday in front of council on December 4th. But I want to thank my council team, Kaylin Pittman, Avery Townsend, John Oswald, Nia Hairston, and Mark Carter. Also, I see we've got our comms team back there, Jose Rodriguez and Brad. Thank you to you guys and to CTV for their assistance in preparing for today's hearing. I also want to thank the community for their support and for tuning in to today's hearing. Thank you, everyone. Stay safe and stay warm, and have a great rest of your day.